Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. A powerful new film about the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King has arrived. For the first time, we see the grotesque dimensions of the FBI's relentless pursuit of King, the result of J. Edgar Hoover's fevered obsession with the civil rights leader.
The FBI says it's clear Martin Luther King Jr. is the most dangerous Negro in America, and we have to use every resource at our disposal to destroy him.
The film is also a fascinating examination of its protagonists, King and Hoover, as complex human beings. MLK FBI, it's called. The latest work from esteemed filmmaker Sam Pollard, my guest, next. Sam Pollard, good to see you again. Welcome.
Good seeing you, Tony.
Nice to have you with us. What a powerful film, Sam. And after I watched it, I thought there were echoes. I thought of the famous line by William Faulkner: "The past is never dead; it isn't even past." That seems to just be so prominent in that film.
Good statement. Excellent point from Mr. Faulkner. Absolutely right. The past is never dead. It's still prominent. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the state of America today, it really makes you reflect back when you watch this film how intense the 60s, where you and I both know that period really well, and realizing that here we are in 2021, Tony, and thinking that America would have made some major leaps, which it has on some levels, but on other levels in terms of racism. And it's a little frightening to think that as we are both men of our age, that we're still looking at a world that's so crazed and so intense.
I've heard you say your goal in your work, and you've directed, you've edited, you've produced, you've written, but your goal, I've heard you say, is to examine to tell stories, to examine the complexities of human lives. And you got two pretty complex people here, Martin Luther King and J. Edgar Hoover, of course, who was the FBI. I mean, the title of the film is MLK FBI, but it's MLK Hoover, isn't it?
Absolutely correct. I was saying to someone a few weeks ago, as a young man in '64, the age of 14, J. Edgar Hoover was a hero to me.
Really?
I didn't know all this stuff that I've unearthed in this film. I mean, I grew up watching all those old movies that we show clips from in the film, like Big Jim McLean and Walk a Crooked Mile and the FBI Story with Jimmy Stewart. And I was a big fan of that ABC Quinn Martin show, The FBI, with Efren Zimbalist Jr. So I didn't know how intensely obsessive and crazed J. Edgar Hoover was until I became an adult.
Yeah. What was your impression, as long as you're talking about it, what was your impression of Martin Luther King in those days, and has that changed?
Growing up in my household, which in many African-American households at the time, Tony, we had three images on our walls. We had Martin Luther King, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Jesus Christ. They were in our living room on our wall because those were the three human beings that my family and us really spoke to. He spoke to us. Dr. King to us was at that time. So then to me was, the man who was leading us like Moses to the promised land. In April 2nd, 1968, Tony, I had just turned 18 years old. And 2 days later, I was at home in my family's apartment in East Harlem, watching the news when Walter Cronkite, and you remember Walter Cronkite being the spokesman for the American public in terms of news, comes on and says, Dr. Martin Luther King has just been shot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. I was in shock, man. I was like in shock because he was our hero. So he was a big hero to me back then,
And did your view of him, how did your view of him mature, or did it mature?
It has evolved. Like every human being on this planet that I've come to sort of dig into as a documentary filmmaker, I'm always curious about their complexity, the level of complexity. At one point, to me, he could walk on water. But now here I am, a man of 70 years old, and every human being, nobody walks on water. As much as I may have affection for them and think of them as very important trailblazers, nobody is immune from being complicated and having their own flaws. So even though I still treasure what Dr. King did for America and the world with his nonviolent action, I also see him as a human being. And that's what we were trying to do when we shaped this presentation of him in this film.
You don't look a day over 69, Sam. The film, what you're shaping in this film. Let's talk about these protagonists. You've got Dr. King, who is the avatar of a movement to fundamentally change the American way of life, and being referred to by those who are opposed, including primarily J. Edgar Hoover, radical leftists who are going to destroy the American way of life. And of course, Hoover is the personification of that American way of life. I mean, it's a very interesting juxtaposition of these two men.
Well, my producer and I, Ben Hadeen, had read this book by the historian David Garrow. And his book was about Dr. King being surveilled by Hoover and the FBI. And we both thought this book was really primed to become a film. So we reached out to Garrow. We took an option on his book. And I happen to know David Garrow because he had been one of our major consultants on Eyes on the Prize too. Mm-hmm. So we ended up flying to Pittsburgh after we optioned David's book, and we spent 4 hours with David, sitting down with a camera crew, basically having him talk about the genesis of his book, the information he had gathered about the surveillance of King, King's relationship with a gentleman who had been a former communist, Stan Levinson, and how the FBI and Hoover thought initially they wanted to surveil and wiretap Dr. King because they thought he was flirting with communism, which, at that time, the Red Scare dominated the headlines.
Exactly.
And as they were wiretapping Dr. King, they learned that he was promiscuous. He was having relationships with other women than his wife, Coretta Scott King. So then they just said, let's use this information. Let's book the hotel rooms he goes to when he travels from city to city. Let's use that information to discredit and destroy Dr. King's reputation. Now, the thing that Hoover didn't bank on back in the 60s, and this, the press didn't dig into people's personal lives like they do today.
I mean, and Hoover was leaking all this stuff he was finding out about the affairs to every outlet he could in the hopes of destroying him through the news media. It didn't work.
Didn't work back then. So he went so far as with his close associate, William Sullivan, they created a letter, basically supposed to be from a Black person, basically saying to King, we know who you are, we know what you do, we give you 3 days to make this decision, basically intimating they want him to kill himself.
Didn't they send one of the tapes to King's house with this letter saying, you ought to kill yourself?
Initially, it went to the SCLC office, Southern Christian Leadership Conference office, and they forwarded it over to Dr. King's house.
Oh, I see.
And Coretta Scott King opened up the letter. She listened to the tape, supposedly King in the situation with another woman. This was going too far as I was concerned. The thing to remember that's also interesting too is that, he had got the approval initially to surveil Dr. King from the Attorney General at the time, as we know, who was Bobby Kennedy,
yes,
who made a complete political and social change after 64 in terms of his politics, So it's really a really fascinating history. And when we interviewed the former director, James Comey, as he says in the film, he felt this is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the FBI.
Yes. We should go a little bit further with David Garrow. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, and he wrote this book based on new information that had been declassified from the National Archives about the FBI investigation of Martin Luther King. They declassified more of it. He went looking into it and found what I've referred to earlier in the introduction, heinous acts that the FBI committed in pursuit of King.
Well, he wrote this essay a few years ago after this information was declassified, And he caught a lot of pushback from people in the community, feeling like, how far, why would he go this far? And basically the essay basically intimated that King had been in the room when another minister was allegedly raping a woman, and that King
Yeah.
just looked on.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just to make it specific. You got William Sullivan. He's the number 2 guy at the FBI. And if I understood the film correctly, in 1968, he updates the file on Martin Luther King with a handwritten notes in the margin of some of that information, alleging what you just said, alleging that Dr. King stood by while a rape took place.
Exactly.
And it doesn't get much more heinous than that. But the controversy you referred to a moment ago from Garrow is that, or about Garrow, is that, why did he even give credence to something
right
like that? I guess the question comes up, and I want to ask you, what discussions, what debates, if any, did you have in terms of including this in the film?
Well, the big debate was, should we put it in or not?
Yeah,
My
of course.
producer and I went around and around. I mean, were we going to do exactly what the FBI was trying to do back in the 60s by putting this material in the film? That's the question we had to ask ourselves. Were we doing the job the FBI was trying to do in the 60s? And we said, okay, if we leave it out, one of the first things that's going to be critiqued is the fact that, say, how come you didn't deal with that thing about the rape allegation, right? We knew that would happen if we didn't put it in. So we decided, after, really looking inside ourselves, that we were going to put it into the film, but we tried to make sure, hopefully we did a good job at it, as trying to present it in a very responsible way. So it didn't seem like a gotcha moment, And, I've had people ask me even now, do you really have to put all that stuff in about King? Do we have to know about his personal sex life? Well, I'm not really looking at the personal sex life. I'm just saying that he was a man who wasn't, simply just married to Coretta Scott King. I'm not detailing what happened in those rooms. I'm just presenting that material. So I felt like that my producer and I, we felt we were being responsible in the way we handled it. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves, though, Tony, is when 2027 comes around, and if those tapes are actually released, the actual recordings are released, will they be edited in such a way to really sort of fulfill what the FBI was trying to do to Dr. King? Or will they be unedited so we have an opportunity to listen to all the tapes and maybe listen to things other than these particular situations that Dr. King was in, but maybe Dr. King's discussions with his lieutenants like Fred Shuttlesworth or Andy Young, or Ralph Abernathy about the strategies they might have been trying to deal with when they went from cities like Birmingham, went to cities like Birmingham or Selma or Albany, Georgia.
Yeah. And just to make it clear for our audience, I talked about how the National Archives declassified some of this, but in 2027, everything is supposed to be released. The tapes,
the actual audio tapes, right?
The actual audio tape.
You can get redacted transcripts.
Yeah.
But then in 2027, unless someone comes along, one of the King family members say, we're going to send a lawyer, we're going to basically, say cease and desist and don't release these tapes, they're supposed to come out in 2027.
And it's interesting about that point. These are audio tapes, and yet that handwritten note on the file that Sullivan writes is, that King was King was there, saw rape, and stood by, watched and stood by. How would you know that?
Yeah, how would you know that?
if it's just audio? This wasn't
Exactly.
These weren't cameras.
No.
So and you have a very renowned scholar in the film, Beverly Gage, who's an expert on the FBI. I think she's also writing a biography of Hoover.
Yeah, she is.
Who, to emphasize your point that you tried to do your best to deal with this even-handedly. And she says, look, there's no corroborating evidence about any of this, but on the other hand, we can't just assume it didn't happen. I mean, it's a question out there. And
that's right.
And coming back to where we started, Sam, in terms of the past is never dead, it's not even past. we have the forces of people who agreed with the FBI and Hoover at the time, calling this whole group of, the civil rights movement. These are radical leftists who are going to destroy the United States.
Doesn't that
And the
sound
reason,
familiar, Tony? Doesn't that sound familiar?
yeah, well, that's what I was. I'm thinking. That's what I was thinking as I watched this film. I'm thinking, wait a minute, didn't I just hear that last summer about the Black Lives Movement? These radical leftists are going to destroy the United States. 65 years later, we haven't learned anything.
Exactly right. I mean, think of it this way. As we were finishing the editing of the film and we're listening to Trump on the stump, in 2020, saying things like, these Black Lives Matter people are causing riots in the cities. It's the same thing like the woman asking Dr. King in the film, don't you think your peaceful protests are causing riots in the cities?
The nonviolence always end up with violence, or almost always, Dr. King. What excuse or what reason do you offer for this approach of creating a crisis atmosphere in a community, which leads to bloodshed, as it has in many southern cities and some northern?
Well, I think we should see the source of the bloodshed first, and we must understand the real nonviolent creed.
And then we can look at this past summer, and Trump is saying, if you elect these socialist Democrats, they will destroy our suburbs. They will destroy democracy. Flip back to the 60s. If you put these communists in power, they will destroy our democracy. I'm telling you, Tony, it's scary. It's scary to hear the same dialogue.
Yeah, but I think it points out the urgency of a film, which, if people would just to go by the title, MLK, FBI, and hear that it's, it looks further into the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King all those years ago, they can say, oh, okay, this is old news. We know all this stuff. It's not old news.
It's not old news. I mean, it's so fascinating to me as I'm, reading the news every day, thinking about what happened on January 6th, thinking about the role of the FBI and who, even today, they still have informants. They're still surveilling organizations on the left and the right. My big question I ask myself, Tony, is they're so savvy, they're so technologically advanced. How come they weren't able to really understand what was going to happen on the 6th? They could know what happened with Black Lives Matter movement, but they didn't know what the extent of what was going to happen at the Capitol. It's mind-boggling.
Well, I'm going to translate that phrase for you, Sam, and that maybe this is not the translation you would accept or meant, but I mean, it's white power.
Thank you.
It's white privilege, and it's we've got two societies separate and unequal. Didn't the Kerner Commission tell us that back in when was that? The early 60s?
It was the 60s, yeah.
Yeah.
You hit it right on the head, Tony. You said it exactly what I would have said. You said it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you agree. So, I guess just you referred to it, but I will just put a bow on it that you were edited. This film premiered at the Toronto Film. Your film premiered at the Toronto Film Festival last September.
Yeah.
Meaning you were editing it through the summer of George Floyd and
yep, my editor
Breonna Taylor, and
my editor was in upstate New York. She even came down with COVID, Tony, for like a month. So we had to sort of stop, and then she got better, and then she went back into the editing phase. So all this stuff, all the political issues, all the social, hump, strum, and drum that was happening in the country was going on as we were editing this film. Now, we knew as the filmmakers that this film would have a certain relevance to today, but we didn't know that the impact would be so strong with the George Floyd death, Breonna Taylor, all the other things that happened in the last 6-7 months.
just so I could examine your reaction to, you talked about your feelings about seeing all this happening while you're editing the film. I wonder if now the film is done and it's out there. I mean, in January, I wonder if you had any time to reflect on Georgia and the remarkable election of two Democrats to the Senate in Georgia.
Listen, I think that Trump gave us a gift. When he went down to Georgia, I think he gave us a gift. I think the fact that Georgia elected Raphael Warnock and Ossoff is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. The challenge now, as you know, Tony, in terms of the Congress, in terms of the power we have now in Congress, how we will be able to hold on to that for the next 2 or 3 years, that'll be fascinating. American democracy is so fragile, I wonder, as I'm getting close to the end of my ride, will it sustain itself before I'm gone?
Yeah, I think a lot of us ask ourselves those same questions across the last 4 years, and especially when we see 2 weeks before a new president is inaugurated, when we see an attack on the seat of our government, on the Capitol, on a mob incited by the president at the time, storming the Capitol of the United States.
It's scary.
I'm speechless. I was speechless. I'm still speechless.
Yeah, but
what that says about, where are we?
I know. I was just reading. You saw what happened in Haiti recently, right? The gentleman who's president doesn't want to give up office.
Yeah, and he's claiming people tried to kill him or something.
He wants to stay in for another year. I mean, this is like, I used to think, well, that wouldn't happen in America, but it would. It could have.
Yeah. And there's some people who believe in those really whacked out people who need to put on tinfoil hats, believe it's going to happen. I believe it's actually going to happen, that Trump's going to come back on March 4th, but let's leave that aside. I want to get back to your film in terms of something perhaps people don't realize or maybe don't remember about the 60s, that it was a time in which Martin Luther King was not very popular. J. Edgar Hoover was extraordinarily popular. The polls, you go back and look at the polls.
Well, that's the thing that surprised me, because somehow in my brain, in my sense of the mythology, Dr. King was beloved by everybody when I was 14, 15 years old. But the reality, it wasn't true. And it got worse after he did his speech at Riverside Church in '67 and came out against the war in Vietnam.
War. I mean, he lost even some of his supposedly ardent supporters.
That's exactly right. And he had to know the impact that would have with his relationship with LBJ and the Johnson administration, who had supported the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the Great Society. I applaud King for being steadfast in his sort of level of moral integrity about the state of the world.
I bring up the polls because in your film you have a fabulous archival footage, very clear of the March on Washington, and I don't remember. I should have looked it up. What was it? 1 million people, hundreds of thousands of people are on the mall to hear King, and of course the I Have a Dream speech. But one of the polls that I read suggested that of the Americans who were aware of that march, who were following the news or whatever, fewer than 1 in 4 supported it. So
sounds right.
There was no contest in terms of popularity between Hoover and Dr. King back in the 60s. And as you say, he was brave enough to realize that just civil rights alone, that the civil rights he was advocating for and the freedom and the justice he was advocating for extended to something that he felt was immoral.
Dr. King was, a man whose sense of integrity in terms of his mission was steadfast and very important. And you have to applaud the fact that with all the resistance he had to face in the 50s and 60s, that he stayed on course. I mean, it's amazing. You got to, and I mean, and it wasn't like there were millions of black people supporting him. You know, it wasn't. It was always a small group of people that were his foot soldiers that followed him on this journey. You know, from Montgomery, Alabama, to the March on Washington. You know, to Chicago, Illinois, to every place. You know, and you know, and hopefully he was hoping that he could continue this fight with that Poor People's Campaign. You know.
Yes, exactly. Well, Sam, let me just say the film is powerful, it's mesmerizing, it's troubling as it should be, and it's called MLK FBI. It's in some theaters. It's also available it's streaming on at least on Amazon Prime, but it might be some other places too.
It's on YouTube, Amazon. You can find it on many streaming services.
Well, thank you for giving it to us, and I hope to see you back here because seems like every week you got another film coming out.
Well, I got another film next year coming out about Max Roach, Tony.
Oh, you've been working on that for a long time. I'm waiting to see that.
It's going to be on American Masters next year.
All right. We'll talk. Well, you got one even now, I think, on HBO, one or two. So, folks, you can find Sam Pollard all over the place. He's probably down at your corner bodega selling chewing gum and sodas. Sam, it's so good to see you. Thank you.
Good seeing you, Tony. Take it easy.
All right. You
Bye.
take care.